The morning sun spilled through the large windows of the airport terminal as people rushed to their gates. Among them was Dr. Thomas Wilson, a 45-year-old neurosurgeon with kind eyes and a tired smile. He had spent the last week performing back-to-back surgeries, and the exhaustion showed on his face, despite his efforts to hide it. Thomas checked his watch and adjusted his hearing aid. He'd needed it since he was 10, after a serious ear infection damaged his hearing. It was barely noticeable, a small, flesh-colored device that most people never spotted unless they were looking for it. Final boarding call for Flight 372 to Boston, the announcement echoed through the terminal. Thomas picked up his carry-on bag and headed to the gate. He was flying to a prestigious medical conference where he would give the keynote speech about his breakthrough technique in auditory nerve restoration. The procedure had helped thousands of people with hearing loss, many of them children who could hear their parents' voices for the first time. As he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, Thomas received a warm smile. "Enjoy your flight, sir." The first-class cabin was half full when Thomas arrived. He stored his bag in the overhead compartment and settled into his window seat. He'd splurged on first class, not something he usually did, but the extra comfort would help him review his presentation notes during the flight. He pulled out a dog-eared medical journal from his backpack and began reading, occasionally making notes in the margins. The cabin gradually filled with more passengers, the usual pre-flight hustle and bustle swirling around him. "Sir? Sir?" Thomas didn't notice someone was trying to get his attention until a shadow fell across his journal. He looked up to see a flight attendant standing over him with an impatient expression. Her name tag read Patricia. "I've been trying to get your attention," she said, her voice sharp with annoyance. "You need to put your seat upright for takeoff." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, reaching for his hearing aid. "I didn't hear you." "My seat is already upright, though." Patricia's eyes narrowed as she noticed him adjusting something near his ear. "What's that in your ear?" she demanded. "All electronic devices need to be turned off during takeoff." "It's a hearing aid," Thomas explained patiently. "I'm partially deaf in my left ear." Patricia crossed her arms. "It looks like earbuds to me." "All earbuds and headphones need to be removed." "It's not earbuds," Thomas said, his voice still calm but firmer now. "It's a medical device. I need it to hear properly." The passengers in nearby seats began to take notice of the conversation. A businessman across the aisle frowned, watching the interaction with growing concern. "Sir, I know what earbuds look like," Patricia insisted, her voice getting louder. "I've been a flight attendant for 12 years. You need to comply with safety regulations." Thomas took a deep breath. This wasn't the first time he'd dealt with this kind of misunderstanding, but it never got easier. "I understand your concern for safety," he said, "but this is a hearing aid. I can show you my medical card if that would help." Patricia's face hardened. "Are you refusing to follow crew member instructions?" The cabin had grown quieter now, with several passengers openly watching. Thomas felt his face grow warm with embarrassment. "No, I'm trying to explain." "Because refusal to comply with crew instructions is a federal offense," Patricia continued, cutting him off. "I'll need you to remove those wireless earbuds now, or I'll have to involve the captain." Thomas started to reach for his wallet to show his medical ID, but Patricia mistook the movement. "Thank you for cooperating," she said, reaching over without warning and plucking the hearing aid from his ear. "I'll keep this safe during takeoff and return it once we reach cruising altitude." The sudden silence in his left ear was disorienting. Thomas felt a wave of vulnerability wash over him as Patricia walked away with his hearing aid, tucking it into her pocket with a satisfied expression. A woman sitting behind Thomas leaned forward. "That wasn't right," she whispered, but he could only partly make out what she was saying. The engines roared to life, and the plane began to move. Thomas sat back in his seat, his heart racing. The medical conference was too important to risk getting removed from the flight, but as the plane taxied toward the runway, he couldn't help but wonder what other challenges this journey would bring. What Patricia didn't know, what she couldn't have guessed looking at his casual clothes and tired eyes, was exactly who she had just humiliated in front of an entire cabin of passengers. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, but Thomas still hadn't gotten his hearing aid back. He kept glancing down the aisle, hoping to catch Patricia's eye, but she seemed to be deliberately avoiding his section of the cabin. The soft ding of the seatbelt sign turning off rang through the plane. "Can I get you something to drink, sir?" asked a different flight attendant, a younger man with a friendly smile. "Actually," Thomas said, leaning slightly closer so he could hear better with his good ear, "I need to speak with Patricia. She has my hearing aid." The young man's smile faltered. "Oh, I'll let her know." 10 minutes passed, then 20. Thomas's frustration grew with each passing moment. Half the cabin had witnessed his humiliation during boarding, and now he was being ignored. He pressed the call button. When Patricia finally appeared, her smile was tight and professional. "How can I help you?" "My hearing aid," Thomas said firmly. "I'd like it back now." Patricia glanced around at the nearby passengers, several of whom were watching the interaction. "Sir, electronic devices are now permitted. However, I need to remind you that earbuds should not be worn during safety announcements." For the last time, Thomas said, his patience wearing thin, "It's not an earbud. It's a medical device that I need to hear properly." A woman across the aisle spoke up. "It's clearly a hearing aid. I saw it before you took it." Patricia's face flushed. "I'm following company policy." "No, you're not," interrupted an older gentleman from the row behind. "My wife has worn hearing aids for 15 years. The airline has never made her remove them." Phones appeared in several hands. Cameras pointed toward the confrontation. Patricia noticed and her expression hardened. "Recording crew members is against airline policy," she snapped. "So is discrimination," said the woman across the aisle, not lowering her phone. Thomas stood up, careful to keep his voice calm despite his growing anger. "I don't want to cause a scene. I simply need my medical device returned to me immediately." "Sir, please take you a seat," Patricia ordered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Not without my hearing aid," Thomas replied. "I'm at a significant disadvantage without it, and you've had no right to keep it this long." A small crowd had gathered in the aisle now. An older flight attendant approached, concern etched on her face. "What's happening here, Patricia?" she asked. Before Patricia could answer, the woman with the phone spoke up. "She took this man's hearing aid during boarding and won't give it back. He's been asking for it since we reached cruising altitude." The senior flight attendant's eyes widened. "Is this true?" Patricia shifted uncomfortably. He was wearing wireless earbuds. "It's a hearing aid," several passengers said almost in unison. The senior flight attendant turned to Thomas with an apologetic expression. "Sir, I'm very sorry for the misunderstanding. Patricia, please return the gentleman's hearing aid immediately." Patricia's lips thinned to a tight line. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small device, practically thrusting it at Thomas. With relief, Thomas put the hearing aid back in place, the world suddenly clearer as sounds returned to his left ear. "Thank you," he said simply. "I expect this will be noted in your report," the senior flight attendant said quietly to Patricia, who nodded stiffly before walking away. As Thomas sat back down, the businessman next to him shook his head. "Unbelievable. You should file a complaint when we land." "It happens more than you'd think," Thomas said with a weary sigh. "Not usually this extreme, but people make assumptions." "Based on what?" the businessman asked. Thomas gave him a knowing look. They'd both understood the unspoken answer. The rest of the flight passed without incident, but Thomas noticed Patricia avoided his section entirely, having other attendants serve his area. He used the time to review his presentation notes, though his concentration was broken. Tomorrow, he would be speaking to hundreds of medical professionals about his revolutionary surgical technique, but right now, he felt like he had been reduced to nothing more than someone else's prejudice. As the plane began its descent into Boston, Thomas couldn't help but wonder if Patricia would have treated him differently if she had known who he actually was. The thought both troubled and saddened him. It shouldn't matter who he was, no one deserved to be treated that way. As the plane continued toward Boston, Thomas tried to refocus on his upcoming presentation. He pulled out his tablet, scrolling through slides that showcased years of groundbreaking research. Each image told a story of hope, children hearing their parents' voices for the first time, elderly patients reconnecting with sounds they thought were lost forever. What Patricia didn't know, what most people on the flight couldn't have guessed, was that Dr. Thomas Wilson wasn't just any doctor. He was the leading neurosurgeon in auditory nerve restoration, a pioneer whose techniques had changed thousands of lives. 3 rows behind Thomas, an off-duty nurse flipped through the airline's magazine. She paused, her finger tracing a headline, "Medical Miracle Worker, the doctor giving sound back to the world." A large photo showed Thomas in surgical scrubs, bent over an operating table with intense concentration. The nurse glanced up, then back at the magazine, making the connection. Meanwhile, Patricia was in the galley, still fuming about the incident. She grabbed a stack of magazines to distribute. "Everything okay?" asked the senior flight attendant who had intervened earlier. "Fine," Patricia replied curtly. "Just a difficult passenger." The senior attendant frowned. "You need to be more careful about assumptions, Patricia. If he files a complaint—" "He won't," Patricia interrupted, confident. "These types never do." "These types," the senior attendant echoed, raising an eyebrow. Patricia didn't respond, just pushed her cart into the aisle and began handing out magazines, the very magazine featuring Thomas's work. Back in his seat, Thomas's phone buzzed with a text from the conference organizer. "Car will meet you at airport. CNN wants to interview you before tomorrow's award ceremony. Also, hospital board sending rep to discuss funding your children's clinic." Thomas smiled tiredly. The children's clinic had been his dream for years, a place where kids from any background could receive the specialized hearing treatments they needed, regardless of their family's ability to pay. After treating wealthy patients for years, he dedicated the last 5 of his career to making his innovations accessible to everyone. Last month, he'd performed surgery on the grandson of the hospital board's chairman, a complex case that other surgeons had refused to take. The boy could now hear birds singing for the first time in his life. Thomas wondered what Patricia would think if she knew he'd been operating on the grandson of one of the most powerful men in Boston just weeks ago. His seatmate, who had witnessed the earlier confrontation, noticed Thomas's medical diagrams. "Dr. Huh, what's your specialty?" "Neurosurgery," Thomas replied simply. "Focused on hearing restoration." The man's eyes widened with recognition. "Wait, are you Dr. Wilson? The one who developed that new technique for children with congenital hearing loss?" Thomas nodded, slightly uncomfortable with the attention. "My cousin's daughter had your surgery last year," the man continued, excitement growing in his voice. "Changed her life completely. She's playing violin now, couldn't even hear music before." A passenger across the aisle overheard. "Dr. Wilson. The Dr. Wilson." Heads turned. The nurse with the magazine stood up, holding the page open to Thomas's feature article. "It is him," she confirmed, showing others the magazine. "He's receiving the National Medical Association's Humanitarian Award tomorrow." Whispers spread through the cabin. A teenager a few rows back leaned forward. "Dr. Wilson operated on my little brother 2 years ago. He couldn't afford to, but he did it anyway." Patricia, still distributing magazines, stopped cold when she realized what was happening. She looked down at the magazine in her hands, then up at Thomas, the color draining from her face as she saw his photo on the cover. The nurse approached Thomas, magazine in hand. "Would you mind signing this? My daughter's in medical school, specializing in auditory medicine because of your work." Thomas smiled kindly and took the magazine. "What's her name?" "Lily," the nurse replied. "She'll be thrilled." As Thomas signed, more passengers gathered, sharing stories of relatives or friends who had benefited from his research. Patricia stood frozen in the aisle, watching as the man she had treated with such disdain was revealed to be someone whose work the airline had proudly featured, the very magazines she had been distributing throughout the flight. The senior flight attendant appeared at Patricia's side. "Now do you understand why assumptions are dangerous?" she whispered. Patricia clutched the stack of magazines, her hands trembling slightly as the reality of her actions began to sink in. In treating Thomas as less than worthy of basic respect, she hadn't just insulted a passenger, she'd insulted a man who had changed countless lives, whose work was celebrated worldwide, and who the airline itself had chosen to highlight as an example of excellence. And worst of all, she had taken away his hearing aid, the very thing he had dedicated his life to helping others with. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing the cabin to shake slightly. Thomas had just returned to his seat after talking with several passengers who recognized him from the magazine. He could feel Patricia's eyes on him from the galley where she had retreated, clearly uncomfortable with the revelation of who he really was. Thomas tried to focus again on his presentation notes. Tomorrow's speech needed to be perfect. He wasn't just sharing medical techniques, but advocating for better healthcare access for underprivileged children with hearing impairments. His mind kept drifting back to the confrontation, though. It wasn't the first time he'd been prejudged, and sadly he knew it wouldn't be the last. The businessman beside him leaned over. "I looked you up online. What you've done for those kids in the rural clinics is incredible." Thomas nodded appreciatively. "Thank you. It's the most rewarding work I've ever done." "After how you were treated earlier," the man continued, lowering his voice, "I hope you'll report." A sudden commotion from the back of the plane cut him off. A woman's panicked voice rose above the ambient noise. "Help! Something's wrong with my father." Thomas instinctively turned in his seat. Several rows back, an elderly man was slumped against the window, his daughter frantically trying to rouse him. The senior flight attendant rushed down the aisle, followed by Patricia. "Is there a doctor on board?" The senior attendant called out, her voice steady but urgent. Without hesitation, Thomas unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. "I'm a doctor," he said, making his way toward the back. Patricia froze when she saw him approach, but quickly stepped aside. The elderly man was pale, his breathing shallow. His daughter looked up at Thomas with desperate hope. He was fine 1 minute, then just started slurring his words and couldn't lift his arm. Thomas recognized the symptoms immediately. He knelt beside the passenger. "Sir, can you hear me?" he asked, taking the man's wrist to check his pulse. It was rapid but steady. The man's eyelids fluttered, and he mumbled something incomprehensible. "I need the first aid kit," Thomas said to the senior attendant, then turned to Patricia. "And find out how soon we can land. He's showing signs of a stroke. Every minute counts." Patricia hurried to the cockpit while the senior attendant retrieved the first aid kit. Thomas conducted a quick neurological assessment, having the man try to smile, raise both arms, and repeat a simple phrase, all classic tests for stroke symptoms. The right side of the man's face drooped, and he couldn't raise his right arm. "What's your father's name?" Thomas asked the daughter. "Robert," she replied, fighting back tears. "He's 72. Thomas spoke clearly, making sure his hearing aid was properly positioned. "Robert, you're going to be okay. We're going to get you help." He turned to the senior attendant. "Does the plane have aspirin?" She nodded and quickly found some in the first aid kit. "If he's not allergic and doesn't have bleeding issues, a low-dose aspirin might help," Thomas explained to the daughter, who confirmed her father had no such conditions. Patricia returned from the cockpit. "The captain is requesting emergency landing clearance at Philadelphia. It's about 25 minutes away." "Good," Thomas said. "I'll stay with him. Can you clear the row behind so he can lie down?" As the flight attendants worked to rearrange passengers, Thomas helped move Robert carefully to a position where he could lie across 3 seats. The entire cabin had grown quiet, everyone aware of the emergency unfolding. Thomas kept monitoring Robert's vital signs, speaking reassuringly to both him and his daughter. "The most important thing now is getting him to a hospital quickly. The symptoms suggest a possible ischemic stroke, which means a blood clot might be blocking flow to part of his brain." "Will he be okay?" the daughter asked, her voice breaking. "Modern stroke treatment has come a long way," Thomas said gently. "The faster he gets to a hospital, the better his chances." Patricia approached with a bottle of water. "The captain says we're being given priority landing. Emergency services will be waiting." "Thank you," Thomas said, looking up at her. Their eyes met briefly. Patricia's expression had completely transformed from their earlier encounter, the arrogance replaced with respect and regret. "Is there anything else you need, Dr. Wilson?" she asked quietly. "Just keep everyone calm and make sure we have a clear path to exit once we land," he replied. As the plane began its descent toward Philadelphia, Thomas continued caring for Robert, whose condition had stabilized but not improved. The daughter held her father's hand, watching Thomas with grateful eyes. "You know," she said softly, "my father has hearing aids too. He hates when people treat him differently because of them." Thomas nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. "It's never about the devices," he said. "It's about seeing the person." Patricia, who was standing nearby preparing for landing, overheard the exchange. She looked down, the weight of her earlier behavior visibly sitting on her shoulders. The plane touched down smoothly despite the rapid descent. As promised, emergency medical technicians were waiting on the tarmac. Within minutes, they had boarded with a stretcher and were carefully transferring Robert. "I'm going with him," the daughter said, gathering her belongings. Thomas wrote something on a business card and handed it to her. "Give this to the attending physician. It explains what I observed and my contact information if they need to consult." "Thank you," she whispered, tears finally spilling over. "For everything." As the EMTs wheeled Robert off the plane, the remaining passengers broke into spontaneous applause. Thomas, uncomfortable with the attention, simply returned to his seat to gather his things. The flight would continue to Boston after refueling, but several passengers would need to be rebooked due to missed connections. In the midst of the chaos, Thomas felt a light touch on his arm. It was Patricia. The Philadelphia airport bustled with activity as medical personnel whisked Robert away on a stretcher, his daughter hurrying alongside. Thomas stood in the jetway watching them go, hoping the quick response would make a difference in Robert's recovery. Around him, delayed passengers checked phones and rescheduled connections, the normal chaos of an unexpected landing. "Dr. Wilson." Thomas turned to find a young airport staff member approaching him, looking slightly starstruck. "The captain told us you were on board," she said. "The medical team recognized your name immediately. They've already called ahead to let the hospital know you were the attending physician during the flight." Thomas nodded politely. "I just did what anyone with training would do." The hospital administrator asked if you'd be willing to consult by phone once they complete their initial assessment, she continued. "They have your contact information from the daughter." "Of course," Thomas replied. "I'm happy to help however I can." Behind them, other passengers from the flight were filing into the terminal. Many nodded respectfully to Thomas as they passed. Some had their phones out, taking photos or typing rapidly. The businessman who had sat next to Thomas approached. "Doctor, I hope you don't mind, but I posted about what happened on social media. People should know how you were treated and then how you still helped everyone without hesitation." Thomas felt a flicker of concern. "That's really not necessary." "It's already getting shared," the businessman said, showing his phone screen. "My brother works for a news station in Boston. He wants to interview you when you arrive." Thomas wasn't comfortable with this turn of events. He'd never sought publicity for his work, preferring to let the results speak for themselves. Before he could respond, an airport official in a suit approached. "Dr. Wilson, the airline's regional director would like to speak with you," she said. "She's in the VIP lounge and extends her sincere apologies for any inconvenience today." The young staff member added, "We've also arranged priority boarding for your continuing flight to Boston, which should depart in about an hour." As Thomas was escorted toward the lounge, he glanced back at the gate area where the flight attendants were gathered. Patricia stood slightly apart from the others, her face pale as she watched the scene unfold. Their eyes met briefly before Thomas was ushered around a corner. The airline's regional director was a formidable woman named Helen, who greeted Thomas with a firm handshake. "Dr. Wilson, I cannot express how distressed we are about the incident on your flight today." "These things happen," Thomas said diplomatically. "No, Dr. Wilson, they shouldn't happen," Helen replied. "We've already received 4 different videos of the incident with your hearing aid. They're spreading online as we speak." She turned her tablet to show him. On screen was a social media post with a video that had already accumulated thousands of views. Patricia removing his hearing aid despite his protests. The caption read, "Airline discriminates against renowned surgeon Dr. Thomas Wilson, takes his hearing aid, then needs his help to save a passenger." "We're already receiving media inquiries," Helen continued. "The irony that you're traveling to accept an award for your work with hearing-impaired children isn't lost on anyone." Thomas sighed. "I don't want this to overshadow the conference or my work." "Understandable," Helen said. "But we need to address it directly. Would you be willing to accept a formal apology from the airline?" While Thomas spoke with airline officials, the videos continued to spread. In the main terminal, 2 passengers from the flight were being interviewed by a local news crew that happened to be at the airport covering an unrelated story. "It was unbelievable," said one passenger. She treated him like he was lying about his disability, then we find out he's literally the top surgeon in the country for hearing restoration. He's on the cover of their in-flight magazine. The other passenger added, then when that poor man had a stroke, Dr. Wilson jumped right in to help, even after how that flight attendant treated him. A true professional. Back on the plane, the remaining crew prepared for the continuing flight to Boston. Patricia sat alone in the galley, scrolling through her phone with increasing horror as the incident went viral. Her hands trembled as she read comment after comment condemning her actions. The senior flight attendant found her there. The captain wants to see you, she said quietly. They're considering whether you should continue on this flight. Patricia nodded numbly, putting her phone away. I really messed up, didn't I? Yes, you did, the senior attendant replied honestly. But what matters now is how you handle it. In the VIP lounge, Thomas was finishing his conversation with Helen when his phone rang. It was the hospital where Robert had been taken. Dr. Wilson, said a voice he recognized as belonging to Dr. Chen, a neurologist he'd collaborated with years ago. Your assessment was spot on. We've administered TPA and are seeing positive responses already. If you hadn't recognized the symptoms so quickly on the flight. I'm relieved to hear it, Thomas said sincerely. Please keep me updated on his condition. The family asked me to convey their deepest gratitude, Dr. Chen continued. And I should mention, there's quite a buzz here about you. Several staff members saw the videos from the flight. Thomas thanked him and ended the call, turning to find Helen watching him with admiration. You know, she said, sometimes people need to see these things to recognize the biases they didn't know they had. You've handled this with remarkable grace. Thomas smiled tiredly. I'm just looking forward to getting to Boston and focusing on tomorrow's speech. Little did he know that by the time he reached Boston, his speech would have taken on an entirely new dimension. And the audience would be far larger than he had expected. When Thomas's plane finally touched down in Boston, the evening sky had already darkened. His phone had been buzzing constantly during the remainder of the flight, forcing him to switch it to silent mode. There were dozens of missed calls from colleagues, reporters, and even his mother, who had seen the videos online and was worried. As Thomas stepped into the terminal, he was surprised to find a small crowd waiting. Camera flashes popped like tiny lightning bolts. A woman in a crisp suit rushed forward with an outstretched hand. Dr. Wilson, I'm Linda from the conference organizing committee. We've arranged transportation to take you directly to your hotel. Thomas blinked, momentarily overwhelmed. Thank you, but that wasn't necessary. Trust me, it is, Linda said quietly, gesturing toward the gathered reporters. The videos of what happened on your flight have gone viral. Every news outlet in Boston wants to talk to you. Linda led him through a side exit to a waiting car, expertly deflecting the shabby questions from journalists. Once inside the vehicle, Thomas finally checked his phone. His hospital's public relations director had sent an urgent message. Call me immediately. We need to prepare a statement. The conference organizers had also emailed. Your keynote is now being moved to the main hall to accommodate increased attendance. Expected audience has tripled. Thomas leaned back against the seat, exhausted. What should have been a routine trip to share his research had transformed into something else entirely. He wasn't prepared for this kind of attention. You holding up okay? Linda asked, concern evident in her voice. Just tired, Thomas replied. How bad is it out there? Linda showed him her tablet. On screen was a news website with the headline, Renowned surgeon has hearing aid confiscated by flight attendant, then saves passenger's life. Below were more headlines. Airline under fire for discrimination against top doctor and medical hero treated like criminal over disability device. The airline's stock dropped 7% today, Linda said. They've issued 3 separate apologies so far. Thomas frowned. I never wanted this to become such a spectacle. People connect with this story, Linda explained. It highlights issues many face every day. The difference is most people don't have your credentials to make others listen. When they arrived at the hotel, the manager personally escorted Thomas to his room, bypassing the lobby where more reporters waited. Inside was a large fruit basket with an apologetic note from the airline CEO. Thomas showered and changed, then called Robert's daughter for an update. Her father was responding well to treatment and would likely make a full recovery thanks to the quick intervention. The relief in her voice was palpable. The doctor said if you hadn't recognized the symptoms so quickly, she trailed off. You saved his life, Dr. Wilson. I'm just glad he's doing better, Thomas replied sincerely. After ending the call, Thomas sat down at the desk to review his presentation for tomorrow. The words on his screen blurred as fatigue set in. His original speech suddenly seemed inadequate given the day's events. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Room service had arrived with a meal he hadn't ordered. Compliments of the hotel, the server explained. As Thomas ate, his phone rang again. It was Dr. Powell, the head of his hospital back home. Thomas, I hope I'm not disturbing you, Dr. Powell said. I've seen the videos. Everyone here has. It's been a long day, Thomas admitted. I bet. Listen, I just got off the phone with the National Medical Association. They want to expand tomorrow's award ceremony. This incident has shined a spotlight on two issues they've been fighting for years: discrimination against people with disabilities and racial bias in how professionals are treated. Thomas set down his fork. Richard, I don't want to be the poster child for these issues. Sometimes we don't choose our moments, Thomas. They choose us, Dr. Powell replied. The governor of Massachusetts is attending tomorrow. So is the federal health secretary. After hanging up, Thomas stared out the window at the Boston skyline. His mind drifted to the children he'd treated over the years, especially those from underprivileged backgrounds who had struggled to access care. Maybe this unexpected attention could help his cause. He opened his laptop again and began rewriting his speech from scratch. Morning came too quickly. Thomas dressed in his best suit and headed downstairs, where Linda waited to escort him to the conference center. Outside the hotel, a small group of people had gathered with signs reading "Thank you, Dr. Wilson," and "End discrimination now." They've been there since dawn, Linda explained. Some are parents of children you've treated. Thomas stopped to greet them, shaking hands and accepting heartfelt thanks. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, approached him shyly. Dr. Wilson? You fixed my ears last year, he said, pointing to his hearing aids. I can hear the birds now. Thomas knelt down to the boy's level. Are you still practicing your piano? The boy nodded enthusiastically. I'm playing in a recital next month. His mother, standing nearby, wiped away tears. We tried to get help for years before we found you, she said. No one would take our insurance. As Thomas stood to leave, a news crew approached. The reporter held out a microphone. Dr. Wilson, will you be addressing the incident on the plane during your speech today? Thomas considered the question carefully. Today isn't about what happened to me, he replied. It's about ensuring that every child with hearing impairment gets the care they deserve, regardless of their background or circumstances. The conference hall was packed beyond capacity when Thomas arrived. Doctors, researchers, students, and journalists filled every seat. On a screen behind the stage, the conference had projected the cover of the medical journal featuring Thomas's groundbreaking procedure. As he prepared to take the stage, Thomas's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Dr. Wilson, this is Patricia from yesterday's flight. I've been suspended pending investigation. I know it means nothing now, but I am truly sorry for how I treated you. What I did was inexcusable. Thomas read the message twice, then slipped his phone into his pocket as the conference director announced his name. The applause was thunderous as he walked to the podium, adjusted his hearing aid, and prepared to speak, not just to the medical community now, but to a world that was suddenly listening. 3 months passed. The Boston Medical Conference had ended, but the conversation it sparked continued. Thomas's speech had been viewed online millions of times, transcending the medical community to reach people around the world. He had spoken not with anger, but with thoughtful conviction about both healthcare access and the everyday prejudices faced by people of color and those with disabilities. Thomas stood at his office window, watching autumn leaves spiral to the ground. His secretary knocked gently on the door. Dr. Wilson, your 2 o'clock is here. Thomas nodded, straightening his lab coat. Send them in, please. The door opened, and Patricia walked in hesitantly. She looked different from how he remembered her on the plane, less confident, more thoughtful. She carried a small folder in her hands. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," she said, her voice softer than it had been during their first encounter. Thomas gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please, have a seat." The silence between them felt heavy with 3 months of public discourse. The airline had issued a formal apology. Patricia had been suspended, then required to undergo extensive training before returning to work. The videos had been viewed by millions, dissected on talk shows, and used in corporate training seminars about unconscious bias. "How have you been?" Thomas asked, breaking the ice. Patricia placed the folder on her lap. "Honestly, it's been the hardest few months of my life, but also the most important." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I deserved to lose my job. I deserved the criticism. What I did was wrong on every level." Thomas leaned forward. "That's not why I asked you here today." "I know," Patricia replied. "You wanted to tell me about your new foundation." After the conference, Thomas had announced the creation of a foundation focused on 2 missions: providing hearing restoration procedures to underserved communities and developing training programs about unconscious bias for healthcare and service industries. "We're launching our first training program next month," Thomas explained. "The airline is one of our first partners. They're implementing it company-wide." Patricia nodded. "That's actually why I'm here." She opened the folder she'd brought. "I've been working with their HR department to help develop the training. Who better to explain what not to do, right?" Her attempt at humor came with a flash of vulnerability. "I heard you've been speaking to employee groups," Thomas said. "Yes, I tell them my story, our story, and what I learned from it." Patricia met his eyes directly. "I don't make excuses for what I did. I tell them exactly what was going through my mind when I saw you, the assumptions I made, and how wrong I was." Thomas appreciated her candor. "That can't be easy." "It shouldn't be easy," she replied simply. "But it's necessary." She handed him a piece of paper from her folder. "This is what I wanted to show you. After my talks, we ask employees to write down assumptions they've made about others. These are real examples from flight attendants, pilots, gate agents." Thomas scanned the page, recognizing patterns of bias similar to what he experienced. "We're making progress," Patricia continued. "Slowly, but it's happening. The airline has also revised their policies on medical devices. They're much clearer now about hearing aids, insulin pumps, and other equipment that passengers need." Thomas set the paper down. "That's good to hear." Patricia hesitated, then asked the question that had clearly been on her mind. "Whatever made you decide not to sue?" "Everyone expected it. The lawyers said you had an open and shut case." Thomas smiled slightly. "Would that have changed anything?" "Really changed things, I mean." Before Patricia could answer, Thomas's phone buzzed. He glanced at it apologetically. "I need to take this. It's about a patient." As Thomas spoke briefly on the phone, Patricia looked around his office. The walls were covered with photos of children, smiling, laughing children with hearing aids or cochlear implants. In the center was a framed letter in childish handwriting. "Thank you, Dr. Tom, for helping me hear my mom sing." Thomas ended his call. "Sorry about that. Where were we?" "You were explaining why you didn't sue," Patricia reminded him. "Right." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "Money doesn't fix problems like this. Neither does punishment alone. What changes people is understanding." Patricia nodded slowly. "I've had a lot of time to understand what I did wrong. But there's something else I wanted to ask you about." She pulled out another paper from her folder. "The airline is donating to your foundation's new children's clinic. They've asked me to volunteer there." Thomas raised his eyebrows in surprise. "I'd be helping with administration, not medical care," Patricia clarified quickly. "But I wanted to make sure you were comfortable with it before I said yes." Thomas considered this for a moment. "The children we help come from all backgrounds. Many have faced discrimination their entire lives for their disabilities, their ethnicity, their economic status. They need to see people who are committed to treating everyone with dignity. That's why I want to do this," Patricia said earnestly. "I can't undo what I did to you, but I can help make sure it doesn't happen to those kids." Thomas stood and walked to the window again. Outside, children played in the hospital's garden, some with visible disabilities, some without, all laughing together. You know, he said thoughtfully, I've spent my career helping people hear. But there's a difference between hearing and listening, between seeing and understanding. He turned back to face Patricia. The clinic opens next month. We could use the help. The relief on Patricia's face was evident. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Thomas, he corrected with a small smile. As they shook hands, both recognized that this wasn't just about personal reconciliation. It represented something larger, the difficult, necessary work of acknowledging bias, making amends, and creating meaningful change. A week later, Thomas stood at a podium again, this time to announce the opening date for the new children's clinic. Cameras flashed as he described the state-of-the-art facility that would serve children regardless of their family's ability to pay. And now, Thomas said, I'd like to introduce some of our volunteers, people who are committed to making a difference. Among the group that joined him on stage was Patricia. She stood tall, no longer the defensive flight attendant from that day on the plane, but someone transformed by confronting her own biases. As Thomas looked out at the crowd of supporters, journalists, and families of future patients, he felt a sense of closure. What had begun as an act of discrimination had evolved into an opportunity for education and growth. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important journeys aren't the ones that take you from one city to another, but from misunderstanding to awareness, from prejudice to respect, from hearing to truly listening.